Today we're continuing our discussions on life in Arkansas in the antebellum period 1840s and 1850s, just before the Civil War. Now, a continuation of these lectures, we had touched on the development of religion in Arkansas. Initially being a frontier state, very widely sparsely populated, churches had a very slow time developing, but by the 1840s, 1850s, a great many of them had emerged, primarily Methodist and Baptist. And keeping in line with the lingering effects of the Second Great Awakening, the new energetic movement of churches and ever try to bring church life and church beliefs into the daily lives of Americans. The churches in Arkansas were also touching on many social reform issues that had been popular across the rest of the country, including temperance, gambling, dueling, trying to bring laws that would, many felt would try to tone down the kind of coarse elements running through Arkansas life. Now, the church had been instrumental in supporting what's called Sabbatarian laws. These are formerly used to be called blue laws in Arkansas. This closing of all shops and services in the state and in the area. And for many years in Arkansas, in fact, all grocery stores and shopping centers were closed on Sundays. Even to this day, they're still hours are still somewhat limited, primarily because of the deep impact of religion in our lives here in El Dorado. So just out of economics, many stores are not going to open very long on Sundays, since most everyone's going to be at church in the mornings and in the evenings. Now, Sabbatarian laws were just one effort to try to keep the Sabbath day holy. People would use this seventh day as a day of rest, as I believe the book of Genesis had commanded Christians to do, to keep the Sunday as a day of worship, concentrating on spiritual issues rather than material gains. Church supporters have also been instrumental in pushing laws banning gambling and dueling, although these would continue somewhat secretively for some time to come. Now, with the development of these issues in Arkansas, we start seeing the emergence of evangelical Protestants becoming a significant force in Arkansas politics. This especially become prominent in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Even to this day, evangelical Protestants are still a very strong part of Arkansas politics. Bible and tract societies also emerged as an effort trying to bring the Bible and bring teachings of the faith to the faithful. In some ways, these early Sunday schools actually acted as a form of education for many people. With Sunday schools, people were learning how to read the Bible. Perhaps not much more than just reading the Bible, but they were learning to read in some small measures. Now, perhaps the most major concern was that of temperance. Alcohol consumption was at extraordinarily high levels, much higher than it is even today. The most popular drink in the 1830s was liquor. A lot of people for years have been using their excess corn crops and wheat crops to brew alcoholic beverages out of. In fact, the average consumption for every adult in the United States in this time period, the 1830s, 1840s, and 50s, was 8 gallons per adult per year. This meant that even those who were not drinking at all, many were binge drinking to dangerously high levels, causing numerous health problems. We have numerous cases of people dying at very young ages because of health problems compounded by alcohol, causing mental, emotional breakdowns, breakup of marriages. In fact, a lot of the issues we see from alcohol abuse in today's society were being dealt with at the same time in the 1830s and 1840s. So the answer to Americans in the 1830s and 40s was temperance. Societies would encourage people to restrain from drinking alcohol. Now, prohibition would be a different movement. This would emerge later on. Prohibition would call for an outright legal ban on alcohol. Temperance is more concentrating on the individual. These temperance meetings were similar to AA meetings, the Alcoholics Anonymous, but somewhat different. The focus was somewhat different. And even the focus of some of the attendees was somewhat different. Many attendees attended more for social purposes, for talking with their neighbors, than for any real interest in abstaining from alcohol use. But nevertheless, the problems of alcohol are very serious. Health problems, there are many people who would drink away their paycheck on alcohol, steal to find money for the next drink. Family violence was a considerable problem. Husbands would come home drunk, abuse their wife and their kids, and it was just simply too much for a civilized society to bear. A lot of drunks in bars getting into fights, murders caused by alcohol. And the belief was that if ordinarily these men sober would be perfectly reasonable people, and if you took away alcohol, the cause, they'd not be falling into this depredations and vice. The problem associated with it would not exist if you removed alcohol from their lives. And for many people, these efforts were very successful to turn their lives around. In some cases, not quite so successful. In 1831, the first temperance society we know was formed in Batesville. Before long, another one was formed in Little Rock. In 1841, a temperance society emerged in Fayetteville. But we have reports from this society that their efforts were not entirely successful. Numerous members attending meetings regularly reporting that they had fallen off the wagon and were drinking again very heavily. And slavery also touched at the church as well. It was an intense effort to try to bring slaves into the church, and very deep division between many religions, particularly Methodists and Baptists, to try to stop slavery, end slavery. So there's a deep divide in the Protestant community at this time about the nature of slavery. Many felt that slavery is biblically ordained, particularly the verse saying, "Slaves, obey thy masters," and others believing slavery is an abomination. Again, both citing the Bible for their beliefs. With a large slave population, many having come from Africa, not being Christianized, many Christian later saw this as an opportunity to proselytize and bring souls to Christianity. But the Christianizing effort, though, had a twofold effect. One, the very legitimate interest in saving souls, but secondly, there was also the interest in trying to control the slave population. One of the utmost priorities in each slaveholding society, controlling the slave population. Many people believe that Christianity had a very humble element to it, that Christianity would teach humility to slaves, teach them to accept that they were slaves, that it was God's will that they were slaves. And again, the verse, "Obey thy masters," a biblical commandment that they must accept their lives as slaves. But Christianity caught on very strongly, very powerfully within the slave community. One thing, churches organized by both free African Americans and slaves became an institution they could control. They had they're completely free to run churches as they saw fit, discuss whatever issues they saw fit, and thus the church became the heart of the African American community, and still is today. In the 1950s and 60s, the civil rights fight was led by Christian preachers from the African American community. But for slaves, Christianity often had another deeper spiritual dimension to it. That Christianity also taught the possibilities of hope and deliverance of faith. The stories of the Israelites being led from bondage in Egypt to the promised land in Israel. Many slaves hoped that that too would happen to them one day. Now, some Christians were teaching that Christianity was ordained by God. Others were teaching, including in Arkansas, that slavery was an abomination. There were a number of abolitionist preachers in Arkansas. Most notable we know of is Jesse Hale. He was a Methodist preacher in northern Arkansas. He denounced slavery openly in his sermons in the 1820s and 1830s, causing many of his parishioners to leave the church, but also gaining a lot of adherents in the process. Now, the divisions between the North and South, the North and Southern churches on slavery issue ended up leading to splits by the 1840s. The Southern Baptists left the American Baptist Church over the issue of slavery, forming the Southern Baptist Convention, and the Methodists as well split into Northern and Southern camps on the slavery issue. Now, the Southern Baptist Convention and the Southern Methodist Church no longer support slavery in any form, but the Baptists never unified, and a portion of the Southern Methodists never reunited into the Methodist Church, today known as the United Methodist Church. But even with this split in the church, many Arkansans are not in favor of it. In fact, we have reports from Batesville in 1845 that fewer than 1 in 10 Methodists of the Methodist Church in Batesville supported the split of the Methodists from the North. Some of these ended up leaving the church, others ended up forming their own churches. But this issue would continue to linger on for some years. Family life in Arkansas, typically about 5 to 6 children. Rural families needing larger families to help on the farms, so they had larger numbers of children than what we do today for the average of 2.2 to 2.5 children. And on top of that, they usually had an extended family of grandparents, parents, in-laws, cousins, sometimes living with the family. In rural areas, the average cabin size was very small, about 324 square feet. Cramped, but livable, especially since most of the time they'd be outside working on the farm. And Arkansas also took an early role in the issue of women's property rights. Now, most other states and territories up to the 1830s and 40s, women, if they came into marriage with any property, that property automatically became the property of the husbands. Not a community property arrangement where they both owned it, but the wife's property became the husband's property only, to do with as whatever he pleased. In 1835, the Arkansas Territory passed a law saying that any property a woman brought into a marriage would stay her property. Because of this, number of husbands dying would leave their wives all their property and farms. By the time Arkansas became a state, and throughout the early stage of the period, 2% of Arkansas farms will be owned by women, being managed and run very successfully by women. And of course, slavery was the primary issue of Arkansas in the United States in the 1840s and 1850s, as sectional divisions began to continue to drive the nation towards civil war. The number of slaves were on the rise in Arkansas. As the North became increasingly free, what few slaves remained in the North were freed, and the North became increasingly abolitionist. The slave population continued to grow in the South. So much so in states such as South Carolina and Mississippi, slaves were a majority of the population, not counting the free black population in addition to the slave population. By 1860, Arkansas had more than 111,000 slaves in its territory. Between 1840 and 1860, Chico County's slave population increased 81%, whereas now 71% of the total population was slavery. Now, along the Mississippi River, particularly the lower Mississippi River, slave population was at its highest. The largest slave holding plantations in the South were on the Mississippi River, Chico County being no exception. But other large cotton producing areas such as Lafayette County, which is present-day Lafayette and Miller County combined, had a 75% slave population. But areas more inland away from the river bottoms, more upland, such as Hempstead County, had only a 39% slave population, and even smaller populations in the northwestern parts of the state. 1 out of every 5 taxpayers in Arkansas were slave owners. And slaves, of course, are used for various different purposes as domestic servants, field hands, or used as unskilled laborers, and often most highly prized were slaves with skills, particularly as blacksmiths. Sometimes, even though it was against the law to teach slaves to read or write, slaves would often be used in stores owned by slave owners, and sometimes to help the slave owners with the accounting work. Treatment varied very widely. Some slave owners treated their slaves very affectionately, but as affectionately as possible. But under the circumstances, there was always that dividing line, always that knowledge that a slave could be sold, immediately known by both the slave owner and the slave as well. Law gave slaves no protection from any kind of abuse. The numerous cases of horrifying brutality, as well as sometimes the slave owners would be working their slaves literally to the point of death. Sometimes be often given their days off. For some reports in Louisiana, some slaves being worked 20 hours a day when the sugar cane was being harvested. The slaves were also encouraged to attend church. Sometimes began to hold a day off to attend the church services and expected to return to work on Monday. For example, the Methodist Church in 1850 claimed that 1 in every 4 members of their churches in the South were slaves. 14% of Methodists in Arkansas were slaves. Now, the Baptist Church, because of its very loose structure, we have very few numbers on, but we can assume that a fair proportion of slaves were members of the Baptist Church. A number of legal cases also involving slaves as well. In Arkansas, dealing with treatment and their rights. These are very tragic cases. End up with a no reprieve or no support or no justice for the slaves at all. But these cases say a lot about the state of the law in Arkansas, the state of the priority for the laws and lawmakers in Arkansas. And that priority was keeping slaves under control. The one overriding fear of any slave society, remember, is fear of a rebellion. The slaves doing to the slave owners what they had done to the slaves. One case was Hervey versus Armstrong in 1854. This case had reached the Arkansas Supreme Court. Now, Armstrong was a slave owner who sued Hervey and other members of the Ouachita County Slave Patrol. Slave Patrol was a group of volunteers, sometimes men kind of drafted from their local area to basically patrol the area for any escaped slaves and patrol for any kind of slave insurrection. It's used to keep the slaves under control, and they end up catching large numbers of slaves as they attempted to escape. This one particular slave patrol in Ouachita County had caught a group of slaves as they were returning home from church one Sunday evening. Now, this group had regularly attended church. The owner had given them permission, trusting they would return Sunday and returning to work Monday. And this group of slaves was with a group of whites. Well, Hervey and the other members of the slave patrol demanded that these slaves produce a written proof they had a pass to go to church. They didn't have this. Slaves did not have this pass. Armstrong didn't really give them one. Had never really thought about it before. Well, this wasn't good enough for the slave patrol, and they accosted the group and beat them, whipping each of them 10 times. They're beaten and bruised so badly they could not work for several days. Armstrong sued the slave patrol, saying they had overstepped their bounds and that they had caused economic damage to him by the slaves not being able to work. Now, the court refused to sign any judgment, basically throwing Armstrong's petition out of court. Not for any legal reason, but saying that any type of judgment against the slave patrol would undermine the authority of the slave patrols across the state, and therefore the ability of these slave patrols to accost and apprehend slaves. Numerous runaways all the time. Arkansas newspapers were filled with reports of classified ads asking for people to be on the lookout for escaped slaves, their names, descriptions, offering rewards anywhere from $5 to $50 to $100. And also classified ads of some newspapers kept having caught escaped slaves, holding them, hoping that, and seeing if anyone had lost one. If not, these slaves would be sold into slavery. fact, even being a free African American was not a guarantee of safety. Free blacks were regularly kidnapped and sold into slavery, even in the North. But again, some slave owners did treat their slaves with some generosity. John Lauda of Washington County, we have a report of in 1834, had freed his slaves upon his death. This had happened in a number of cases, slaves being freed in the wills of slave owners. Mr. Lauda, in 1834, not only freed all of his slaves, but gave them a form of back pay restitution for their services. Each slave received $2,500 in gold. And counting for inflation, that'd be perhaps close to $50,000 today. Another case comes from 1857, Jackson versus Bob. Bob, because the slave in this case had no last name. Slaves were stripped of their family identities when they were brought into slavery. Sometimes they would adopt the name of the families that had owned them, just for sake of convenience, and sometimes because they really were blood relations. Slave owners were known to have illicit relations with their slaves, producing offspring. In fact, half of all free blacks in Arkansas were mulattoes, products of a union between a white and an African American. In the case of Bob, he was a slave who had sued as a slave owner in Sevier County. Now, the case had come back from something that happened very often. Many slaves, they would try to buy their freedom or get a promise they worked so long for a slave owner to be able to be released on a certain date. Bob was one of those slaves. Unfortunately for Bob, he also became one of those slaves who was very often double-crossed in these dealings, because the laws in the states did not require the slaves to do anything, slave owners to honor any agreement with their slaves. Bob was born in 1814, and said his original owner, a man named Elliott Brown from Mason County, Virginia, had promised that Bob could work for himself and use his proceeds to buy his freedom when he turned 21. Unfortunately, Mr. Brown died in 1825, and Bob was inherited by Brown's grandson. And his grandson then sold Bob to Robert Hamilton, Sevier County, in 1834 for $600. At this point, Bob's 20 years old, and informs Hamilton of his original agreement with Brown. Hamilton was sympathetic and said that he could work for his freedom and buy his own release when he was 25, pushing the date back a little bit. Hamilton wanted his money back for his efforts for Bob. Well, Bob kept up his efforts, but Hamilton was not nearly as sympathetic as Bob originally thought. Age 25 came and went, 1839. Bob kept up, trying to convince Hamilton to freedom, and finally by 1845 ran away. Hamilton later died of natural causes, and Bob was sold to Isaac N. Jackson, also of Sevier County. And this time, Bob was so frustrated that he sues the Sevier County Court for his freedom, saying that these contracts he lived up to these end of these contracts and he was freed. So Jackson was sued in 1851. In fact, it's very unusual that African Americans even allowed to even bring a case throughout the South. Usually they were denied access to the courts. But Bob was a very well-known figure in Sevier County. He had was well-known, worked very hard, and not caused any trouble for anyone, and everyone knew about the deals that had been made for his freedom. The Sevier County courts agreed that yes, Bob was entitled to his freedom. Well, Jackson appealed these cases all the way up to the Arkansas Supreme Court. Or in 1857, the Supreme Court said that its interest was most in protecting slavery, and that Bob had no right to sue the court, and slave owners were under no obligation to honor any agreement with their slaves. So Bob would remain in slavery until the end of the Civil War when he was freed. Politics of Arkansas was mostly Democratic at this time. The Whig Party, the other major party in the United States at that time, had significant support, but it was starting to wane considerably. Whig support mostly based on a reaction to Andrew Jackson and his policies. And since Jackson had died in 1845, his influence had steadily waned, and the antagonism toward Andrew Jackson declined as well. Whigs never really had a lot of strong issues they could unite their party on, and as such, as the sectional tension grew in the United States, the party was pulled apart until it finally disappeared and collapsed in 1854. Now, 75% of Arkansans regularly voted in elections. And between 1836 and 1852, in presidential elections, the Democrats regularly won by more than an average of 11 points over the Whigs in the state. In statewide elections, Democrats would regularly win by 60% of the vote. One Whig ever won a statewide election, Thomas Newton. He filled an unexpired term when Archibald Yells, when he resigned to go fight in the Mexican War in 1847. He won by 23 votes over 4 other Democrats and served for 3 weeks in Washington until the new election put a new congressman in place. Democrats regularly held 75% of the state legislative seats and state senate seats, a trend that still continues today. Arkansas then is now still a very strongly Democratic state, still a very strong element of anti-establishment voters in the state banding into an anti-democratic faction, which will take several forms this year in the state. Actually, the Whigs had scored a number of near misses, but the Democrats had managed to win very strongly in all these elections. Now, as the dynasty, the Conway-Sevier family effectively had controlled Arkansas politics. By 1852, there are some people kind of growing kind of weary of having one group in control of the party all the time. But the Conway-Sevier family, the dynasty, had always managed to serve the state very effectively. But it's the idea that one group controlled the state so much was bothering a lot of voters. Well, in 1852, Elias N. Conway is put forward by the dynasty as the candidate for governor, facing a very deeply divided Democratic Party. So Brian Smithson of Fayetteville becomes the opposition candidate. The Whigs were too weak to offer a statewide candidate, so they backed Smithson, endorsing him as their candidate. Smithson called for internal improvements. It was a very close election, which Conway ends up winning by 3,000 votes. The dynasty is able to prove that its strength is still very much intact. Conway wins with 55% of the vote. In 1856, Conway would continue to expand his hold on Arkansas politics, expanding his lead to 13,000 votes, winning with 65% of the vote. By this time, the Whig Party disappeared, and the Natives Party, the American Party, also known as the Know-Nothings, was trying to fill the void. But the American Party is on the edge of collapse, particularly because their main issue, immigration, fighting Irish Catholic immigration from entering an evangelical Protestant nation, did not have a lot of appeal in Arkansas. State did not have a lot of Irish Catholic immigrants, or a lot of immigrants, period. And the slavery issue, again, was tearing apart the American Party, which was trying to stay neutral on it. So Conway and the Democrats easily swept aside the challenge from the Know-Nothing Party. In 1850, Arkansas had grown big enough for a second congressional district, the dividing line essentially being the Arkansas River, bringing in an interesting new element in the state party politics as the state approached the Civil War. Figures such as Thomas Hindman, a gifted orator and Mississippi native of Helena, coming into the scene. 1856, he ran for Congress in the Northern District, but lost the nomination in the district convention by 277 after 277 ballots. Again, a very narrow loss, but Hindman got support of the dynasty by 1858 and won the election, and very quickly became a leading figure for secession in Arkansas. And this concludes our lecture on politics of the late Statehood period.